Now you're lying.
Well, good morning, Legacy Bible Church. It is Wednesday, and we're here for chat time with Sarah. And so, as always, we'll just get right into it. So, Sarah,
Live and unscripted.
Yes.
Okay. Well, good morning. So we're going to talk today. The title is Tongues and Interpretations. And oh my goodness, there's always so much to talk about.
Oh man,
I know. I keep going back.
that's a big subject.
I know. So the way I was going to kind of just bring this about is we have several, probably months now, we talked about the women's role in church.
Mm-hmm.
And we went to 1 Corinthians 14. It was 14:33 or 34. And we discussed the women's role in church because that's how Paul writes it. But we then discussed that it's not women, biological women,
That's right.
but it's your mind, yourself,
Mm-hmm.
and not. And we have to keep that in check in the church, not. So, anyways, well, that was a whole.
Okay, real quickly
Yes.
on that, just so we don't leave it there, because that'll leave a lot of people confused. You have to understand when Paul talks about the woman being silent in the church in chapter 14, you have to understand that in the context of chapter 11, where it says Christ is the head of the man, is the head of the woman.
We've done a live Q&A on that too.
And we have talked about that in the past, so we won't repeat it all here, but just the very short version.
Yes, that's, if you know that.
Is the woman is representing the knowledge base that we hold to, the knowledge base of a human being. The man is on air. The man is the mind that is surrendered to God and is being edified by Christ. And so Christ is the head of the man, and the edification that we receive from the Lord should then govern our human mind in our thinking about Jesus and about the salvation plan of God. So Paul is not referring to biological women and biological men. He's referring to the reality in the church that is real for all believers, whether you're a biological man or a biological woman. You should see that chapter 11, that Christ is the head of the man, is the head of the woman, refers to every believer. Mm-hmm. Every believer has Christ as the head. Every believer has who prays in the Spirit. The assumption there, Paul is saying, these are men and women, believers who pray in the Spirit. We will have an edified mind. We'll receive edification from the Lord. That's the reference to the aner. Aner is a blessed man, by the way. It's not anthropos. It's aner, which is a blessed man. It's receiving edification from the Lord. And then the edification that we receive from the Lord should be what governs us in our daily thinking in the world. That's the reference to the woman. That's Christ is the head of the man, is the head of the woman. And that's how to interpret woman in chapter 14.
I think that was a perfect explanation of that.
Does that make sense?
Yes, okay. Makes sense. So all of that being said, churches abuse that verse to keep women from speaking.
Have.
So another
very, very tragic.
Yeah. So another way that the church has abused what Paul has written when it comes to speaking in tongues in the church. So I had a conversation with a cousin of mine, and we were talking about speaking in tongues, and he said, I don't know much about speaking in tongues. I just know that the Bible says you can only have 2 or 3 people speak in tongues, and you have to have an interpretation. He said, that's all I know. So it got me thinking with 1 Corinthians 14:26. I'm going to read it.
Okay.
Starting with 26. What then is it, brothers? Whenever you come together, each one has a psalm, has a doctrine, has a revelation, has a tongue, has an interpretation. Mm-hmm. Let all things happen toward edification. And if anyone speaks in a tongue, let them happen according to 2 or as many as 3. And for each part also one must interpret. Should I keep going? But if ever there is not an interpreter, let him be silent in the church and so let him speak to himself and to God.
Mhm.
And let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let others discern.
Mhm.
So it keeps going. But if ever an interpretation might be revealed to another who is sitting, you've got that next. I'm reading from Styros, the Wood Bibles, also. But if ever an interpretation might be revealed to another who is sitting, let the first be silent, for you are able to prophesy according to one at a time, in order that all may learn and all may be exhorted, and the spirits of the prophets and subjects are subject to the prophets, for God is not of chaos, but of peace.
Yeah.
So that has been used to silence basically people speaking in tongues.
To suppress it.
Yeah. And as I was reading this,
I've heard it characterized this way, that Paul has literally been said and taught this way, again, tragically, just wrong and a very destructive interpretation, that Paul, actually, it has been said, Paul de-emphasizes speaking in tongues. It's been taught that he's not emphasizing speaking in tongues, but rather he's de-emphasizing, and that is a tragic misinterpretation.
And so as I was reading this to get ready for this conversation, and you just keep going up and up because you taught me to pretext. It even goes all the way up to chapter 14, verse 13. Therefore, let the one speaking in a tongue pray in order that one might interpret. And then it keeps going on, but that caught my eye, and NIV makes it sound like you have to have an interpretation. And these words from Styros is in order that one might interpret. So it's like, okay, we're praying. I'm thinking that so that it comes back to us, because we know the measure comes back to us.
Yeah.
But what I was wanting to get in today is the place for tongues in church, because this sounds very clear that Paul is saying you need to have an interpretation or be silent. So what is he saying? How does that
reconcile with it all? So when Paul says that there should be an interpretation, or let the one speaking in a tongue be silent, what he is saying, and what followed be silent, there was another phrase there.
Let's see.
So let's read it.
Okay. And if anyone speaks in tongue, let them happen according to 2 or as many as 3, and for each part also one must interpret. But if ever there is not an interpreter, Robin, this is 27 and 28, let him be silent in the church, and so let him speak to himself and to God.
There you go. And so what Paul is saying there is that if we're in a corporate setting and they're speaking in tongues and there is not interpretation, you'll give it maybe 1 try, 2 tries, even 3 tries, or events, I'll call them events of speaking in tongues. Those are times and seasons, the kingdom of God. Each event of speaking in tongue, it's an event. And Paul is saying in a corporate setting, for the purpose of order and edification, he's saying there needs to be interpretation. And here's the key on that passage there. When he says, if there's not interpretation, let the one speaking in a tongue be silent, in order that his event, his prayer, what is happening there is between him and God. And so speaking in tongues is never a matter of the mind. It's always a matter of speaking. And so Paul is saying there, lower your voice. I'm going to paraphrase here so that you understand what Paul is meaning. If there's not interpretation, I'm not telling you not to speak in tongues. I'm telling you, lower your voice so it's not impeding the corporate, what is happening in the corporate sense. You can pray to God, but lower your voice so that it's not impeding the corporate setting and what's happening in a corporate setting. If there's not interpretation, go ahead and pray in tongues, but to be silent is lower your voice so that your praying in a tongue is between you and God and not for a corporate context, edification. Does that make sense?
Okay, so when I first started talking to you, and I would listen to your teachings, and I would come Wednesday morning to talk to you, and when I first started, I would be fired up and like, I'm going to shut him down this time. I'm going to prove him wrong this time.
Yeah.
And you'd always
I
take
love
so
those
much time
conversations.
and explain to me. So even today, sitting here after being with you for Legacy Bible Church maybe 3 years, but with you for 5 years, I was sitting here reading this and I was like, what are you going to say about this? Because it's clear. Because it very clearly says 3 times. Because I've always thought 3 people. Like, how are you going to explain this one? And then as soon as you said that's trying 3 times, I go over and read it again, and I'm like, okay. It says, and if anyone speaks in tongues, if anyone speaks in a tongue, let them happen according to 2 or as many as 3. And when you said that's basically like one person, speaking out loud, and they keep trying, Paul's saying, okay, if there was an interpretation, just sit down for a minute, pray between you and God, and just so that there's not chaos. It just made sense like that, even though I've read it so many times, and I'm always thinking that's 1, 2, 3 people, and then we need to shut it all down. And that's not what he's saying.
Paul would never impede speaking in tongues. But what he will do is, for the sake of the corporate setting, where there are going to be people present who don't pray in tongues. They don't know what it is. They're confused by it, maybe even irritated and offended by it. And Paul is not shutting down praying in tongues, but he is saying that for the corporate good, there needs to be interpretation. And if there's not interpretation, then Paul is saying, as the apostle who is giving instruction to the church, he said, I'm going to tell you, just lower your voice and pray in tongues in a manner that doesn't interrupt the corporate service.
That's why it says, let them be silent in church, and so let him speak to himself and to God.
Let the speaking be between you and God, not for the corporate good. Paul would never impede or shut down speaking in tongues, because that is his primary emphasis. That's what his entire ministry is about, is that the children of God, those who had been given faith to believe, would become spiritual worshipers of God. And he would never and does not ever impede that. In fact, that's why he finishes chapter 14 by saying to the church, do not hinder speaking in tongues. Do not forbid speaking in tongues.
I know that you've studied a lot about, the New Testament church. What would a service look like? Like, what did this look like?
Yeah. Well, you have to use your imagination on that and the scriptures here. And I believe that it would be this, is that corporate speaking in tongues and corporate prophesying was a normative part of the corporate church service, of the physical, visible church assemblies. Corporate speaking in tongues and corporate prophesying was normative. They expected it. Now, I will say that the understanding Paul's teaching in chapter 14, you would draw from that there was more there was more corporate prophesying than there was corporate speaking in tongues. You can draw that inference out of chapter 14. But both of them, speaking in tongues and prophesying, were normative for the church. And so what Paul was doing here in 1 Corinthians is bringing order to that practice, so it didn't get out of hand, so that it didn't, in a matter out of the flesh, become a matter of the flesh, where rather than being something that's edifying for the church, it becomes something chaotic that was divisive. And in fact, that's what had been happening in Corinth. And that's why Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, was to give guidelines. These are guidelines for the church, and he's bringing guidelines for the sake of order to the church at Corinth.
Okay, so I'm going to summarize what I believe I'm understanding correctly for this verse, that I have so many questions. That he was not saying that you can only have 2 or 3 people speak in tongues with an interpretation. He's saying, if you speak out loud in the corporate setting where everyone can hear you, and you try once and no one responds with an interpretation, try twice, maybe no more than 3 times, then you just need to sit down and just pray between you and God.
No,
is that how would you say it?
No, I would say it this way, that in a corporate service, and I think this is Paul exercising his apostolic authority to bring a guideline to the church. He's not stating this as a command that he's received from the Lord. He's saying this in the context of his apostolic wisdom, maturity, authority. He's saying in a corporate setting, we're going to have at most 3 events of corporate speaking in tongues. It could be 3 events from one person. It could be 1 event from 3 different people.
Okay.
But he's saying we're going to, in this corporate setting, we're going to allow up to 3 events. He's bringing that guideline to bring order to a church that was out of control and was beginning to divide and to decay.
Okay.
He's bringing order, and he's saying so there will be 1, maybe 2, maybe 3, up to 3 events of corporate speaking in tongues. But he's saying that at that point, he's saying there's a point at which the Lord is not he's not a Lord. God is not a God of chaos. God is a God of order. And if God, Paul, again, I'm going to paraphrase Paul. He's saying, if God wants to bring a message to this corporate setting, he's not going to do it endlessly. He's going to deliver it, and it's going to be done. And so we're going to allow the Lord that freedom to operate in our corporate setting. And we're going to give, for our sakes here, 1, maybe 2, maybe 3 opportunities for that to happen. But beyond that, I'm going to say Paul as the apostle to the Gentiles, whom the Lord has given this revelation and this mission to bring this teaching to the Gentiles, is that at some point we're going to recognize this is not the Lord operating here. We're just operating in flesh. And so for the sake of a church that has been operating in the flesh, they have been out of control. They've been dividing. People are breaking apart over this issue. You say, I'm going to bring order, and here's how we're going to do it.
And the same thing with prophecy. And let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the others discern. But if ever an interpretation might be revealed to another who is sitting, let the first be silent. For you are all able to prophesy according to one at a time, in order that all may learn and all may be exhorted. And the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets.
So let's talk about what that means when he says, read that first part again, where it says, and one is sitting.
And let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the others discern. But if ever an interpretation might be revealed to another, and this is in italics, who is sitting, let the first be silent. Okay,
so what he is saying there, if someone has, while someone is prophesying, if another one who is sitting, the idea is there, if you're speaking, you're going to stand, okay? And so while one is standing, prophesying for the corporate edification, and one who is sitting has an interpretation, Paul's saying the interpretation is going to take precedence. The one standing who is prophesying is going to pause, not tell him that you can't prophesy. He says, you're going to give deference to the one who has an interpretation. Why? Because the interpretation is interpretation of a tongue, and speaking in a tongue is directly from the Lord. And so the one who has interpretation of a tongue is going to take precedence over the one who's prophesying with his own mind. Remember prophesying, remember Christ and the man and the woman. The one prophesying is speaking with the mind of the aner man. The one who is interpreting is giving an interpretation of the mind of Christ.
Okay.
He's going to take precedence. So Paul is saying there, if there's been a speaking in a tongue and there hasn't been an interpretation, then we're going to allow one to prophesy. But if after one begins prophesying, then there's an interpretation, the one prophesying is going to put his prophecy on pause so that we can hear the interpretation, because the interpretation is deriving directly from the mind of Christ. And we're going to give deference. We're going to give priority to the one who has an interpretation.
So then when he says, for you are all able to prophesy according to one at a time, he's saying that you can go to someone one at a time and prophesy? Is that what he's saying? Like, because that interpretation is given, the speaking in tongues is directly from the Lord. The interpretation is directly from the Lord. So the prophecy, he's basically saying that can be done at any time.
Yes. He's saying that the prophecy is yours. You own it. When you have a prophetic word, that becomes your possession. You have it. Now, what happens is when an interpretation is received, the Lord has worked. And you don't put that on pause. You don't make the Lord wait for you who's speaking with your own mind. When an interpretation happens, that's a work of the Lord, and it is going to take priority over the one who has a prophetic word. It is giving deference to the Lord himself. And so it's really a beautiful, in Paul's meaning and teaching and guideline here, it's really a beautiful way of recognizing with an interpretation. The Lord has just acted. The Lord has just given the interpretation of the tongue that he gave that was spoken previously. And we're not going to allow someone who's speaking a prophetic word that they own with their own mind say, Lord, just wait a minute here until this guy is finished with his prophetic word, and then we'll let you speak. No, Paul's saying no. When the Lord acts, when the Lord speaks, he goes first. You sit down and let that one stand and give the interpretation. And then when that's done, you've still got your prophetic word. You can still speak your prophetic word. We'll give the floor back to you, just like up to three prophets, one at a time. We can do that because you possess it, you own it. We'll come back to you. But when the Lord speaks, he goes first. And
how do you know though that someone's not making up an interpretation?
Well,
you don't.
That's one of the reasons Paul says we'll give up to three opportunities there, and then we're cutting it off. It's not going to go on endlessly. He's recognizing that, just like the church at Corinth has been doing, is that this can be and also for prophetic words too, by the way, that speaking in tongues and the realm of interpretations and prophetic words can be works of the flesh and not genuine works done from the Lord. And so his guideline is we're going to put a cap on it. And if it's in the flesh, well, we're going to end it at 3. But we're not going to say don't do it. We're not ever going to say we're not going to have corporate speaking in tongues. We're not going to have interpretation. We're not going to have prophetic words. He's recognizing that's a normative part of the corporate service. That's how the Lord works.
And so do you think, when you and Robin and I, before we come on, we always stop and pray. We pray in the Spirit. So back in the church, when he's talking about, do you think there's at some point where they were probably all praying and speaking in tongues? Is there a point when it was silent and one person would, because like we all three sit and pray out loud in tongues. We all can hear each other. There's no interpretation. That's okay.
Yeah.
So do you think the reason why he had to address this is maybe there was teaching going on and everything was silent and one person would stand up and disrupt? I guess disrupt. If it's from the Lord, it's not disrupting. Is that kind of why he's having to say that, maybe?
Ask the question again.
So, okay. So why is he making a big deal about speaking in tongues out loud?
Yeah, you have to understand the context for which he's writing the letter to the church at Corinth. This is not a general circular going out to all the churches. Like Ephesians has been generally understood as a circular letter, not to the church at Ephesus, but a general letter for the church. The letter to the church at Corinth, it was not meant to be a circular letter, even though it has been used as the guideline for the church as a circular letter. Rather, Paul, pardon?
Circular letter meaning.
A general letter
going
for
out
the
to
church.
all.
To circulate general.
Paul was in Ephesus at the time he wrote. It was not the first letter he wrote. There was actually a prior letter that he had written that he references in 2 Corinthians. And when the first letter that we don't have a record of was received by the church at Corinth, they sent a contingent from Corinth to Ephesus to meet with Paul and to talk with Paul about that first undocumented letter we have. So what I want you to picture here is a church at Corinth is being assaulted by Judaizing Christians that are from likely from Jerusalem, and creating a lot of division in the church, a lot of controversy, bad teaching, almost if I can use it, a lot of name calling about what's going on in the church at Corinth, and it's beginning to create a lot of division within the church at Corinth. So Paul wrote one letter from Ephesus. We don't have a record of it. We know about it from his reference in 2 Corinthians. And a contingent came from Corinth to Ephesus to meet with Paul, to have further conversation. And then out of that conversation, Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. And he sent the letter, 1 Corinthians, back to Corinth with this delegation of leadership that had come from Corinth to meet with him at Ephesus. And so they took this second letter that we call 1 Corinthians. They took the leaders of the church at Corinth who had met with Paul, took the letter back to Corinth. So this is a letter of education, edification of for the church at Corinth that was being assaulted by Judaizing Christians, likely from Jerusalem, that was struggling. I mean, it's one of the reasons why Paul said at the beginning of 1 Corinthians that some of you say you're of Apollos, and some of you of Paul, and some of you of Christ, and he's dealing with a church here that was coming apart at the seams, and he's writing 1 Corinthians to bring correct doctrine to their thinking and to bring some order to the chaos, if you will, of operating in these spiritual gifts that Paul was recognizing, likely from what was being explained to him by this contingent from Corinth, that was largely probably operating in the flesh and not genuinely from the Lord. And so he's bringing some guidelines here.
It's like the guys come to him and say, "We got your first letter, but it's an utter chaos. The whole thing is out of order and chaos." So Paul's like, "Okay, I'm going to give y'all some tips and let's put this in order." And I wish I would have known that what you just said a long time ago, because now, I mean, even just kind of flipping through, reading little parts that used to be my favorite from 1 Corinthians, it puts it all in a whole new perspective.
A whole new perspective. It absolutely, and context.
Yeah.
And that's why, I talk a lot about history in my teaching, because it's so important to have a historical perspective on the New Testament documents. It helps you understand how to read the New Testament documents when you understand the historical context that they were created in.
That changes it still, but it makes so much, enlightens, like, okay, that makes so much sense. Why he's having to sit down. Like, I can picture it in my mind, him sending a letter, someone coming back saying, okay, this is what's happening. And so he's like, okay, because, at one point where he says, I'm writing this not to shame you, but to show you. It's like, oh, that's why it just puts it in so much.
My take on that first letter that he referenced in 2 Corinthians that we don't have a record of, my take on that is Paul was probably pretty harsh. He was probably pretty harsh in that letter, and there's a place where he makes sort of an allusion to that fact in 2 Corinthians. But I think that there's a good reason why that's not a part of the Bible, is that it was not everything Paul wrote was likely divinely inspired for the purpose of becoming scriptures.
So you're saying he was a human? And he was
affected? Paul was actually, he would tell you that.
Yeah. He would tell you that, in
fact, he called himself the greatest of sinners. He looked back on his persecution of the church, and he called himself the greatest of sinners.
Wow. Thank you for taking the time to always answer my
Did that get to the crux
Yeah,
of your
It absolutely did.
question?
And it makes so much sense. I can't even tell you between that verse about the prophecy being, or the tongues being in order and all that. I would read that many, many times. It just kind of counted it as something I was never going to understand, just the same way with the women in the church. I was just never going to understand that. I had to still believe that God loved women, and I still had to believe that there was a place for tongues and prophecy, but I didn't quite understand it all, so I just would skip over it. Not going to read it anymore because I don't get it.
Before we finish here, let's go back to verse 13 and talk about that just briefly.
Okay.
That gets to the crux of what we're talking about here, and has been grossly misinterpreted, mistranslated, misunderstood.
Well, if I'm going to do that, then I'm going to first read the NIV.
Okay,
I'm
good.
gonna put up SWB on the screen and you'll read NIV.
Okay, so Robin's going to put up Stalross, and I'm going to read. So just 1 Corinthians 14:13 says, "For this reason, this is the NIV that says, for this reason, the one who speaks in a tongue should pray that they may interpret what they say."
And so what NIV is saying there is that, and I'll use myself as an example. If I'm going to speak in tongues in a corporate setting, that I should then, in addition to speaking in tongues, which is our unknowable utterances, I should pray with my mind to the Lord. Lord, please give me an interpretation of that tongue. That's what NIV is saying. Now, and that's the way it's been commonly interpreted, grossly misinterpreting Paul. Read the Stalross version.
And on that note, in misinterpreted and misused, I think that sometimes I think that people might start speaking in tongues, because I know there's times when you can't even help it, like you just start speaking in tongues, and that probably puts pressure on someone to come up with an interpretation.
Oh man!
And that's not even from them.
That's
okay,
not But
so
read
okay.
Stalross, and then let's talk about that.
Therefore, let the one speaking in a tongue pray in order that one might interpret.
Yeah. So what Paul is, and that's a very literal rendering there. So what Paul is saying there, he is saying it's actually what they call a juice of command. Let one, it's a third person command, not you do this, let us do this. In the first person, it's called the juice of command. He's saying, but it's still a command. Let us, or let the one praying in a tongue, that's a command. Let the one praying in a tongue, speaking in a tongue, pray. Paul's essentially saying there that speaking in a tongue is praying. It's just like Paul in Romans 8:26, one that everyone is familiar with, where he talks about spirit-enabled prayers of unknowable utterances. Where he talks about the Spirit helping us in our weakness because we don't know what to pray. That's exactly the context here. Let the one speaking in a tongue pray. Paul is just simply acknowledging that speaking in a tongue is prayers to God, just like he did later when he says, be silent and if there's not interpretation, be silent and let your speaking be between you and God. Speaking in a tongue is prayer. So he's saying, let the one speaking in a tongue pray. Let him pray. Don't forbid it. Don't hinder speaking in tongues, what he says in verse 39. And then the conjunction is a hina conjunction. It's to give a purpose for something. So a good translation for the hina for the hina conjunction is in order that. So in order that, it's a purpose clause. He's saying the reason for this, the purpose that let the one praying in a tongue pray, the purpose is in order that there might be interpretation.
So that you can actually, so that you can actually know what was released from heaven.
Yes, but he's saying, don't hinder speaking in tongues. Otherwise, how are you going to have an interpretation that'll edify the church?
Yeah.
He's saying the whole purpose of a corporate setting is for common edification, that the church can be edified. if you don't have speaking in tongues, how are you going to have an interpretation? If there's no speaking in tongues, neither will there be an interpretation to edify the church. So he's saying, let the one speaking in a tongue pray, so that there will be interpretation, which edifies the church. That's what Paul's interested in. He wants edification for the church in the corporate setting.
Okay, I'm going to say something off camera because I think it's really important for people to understand. 1 Corinthians 14:13. Therefore, let the one speaking in a tongue pray. Speaking in the tongue is the pray. It is not, and you have to understand where your apostrophes are. Therefore, let the one speaking in a tongue pray in order that one might interpret. That's not what it's saying. He's not praying for somebody to interpret.
Right.
It is saying, let him pray. Let him speak in tongues.
Yes.
So when he's praying, someone might interpret.
That's
but
exactly
you've got
what it
to
means.
watch your punctuation
It's so
in there.
different in the NIV. That changes everything.
Yeah.
It changes literally everything.
But even as I read it the first time, therefore let the one speaking in a tongue pray in order that one might interpret. My mind was still reading it. Let him pray for interpretation.
Yes.
No, his tongue is the prayer.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's a difference. In this,
By the way, that's my wife Robin speaking there.
here's the difference in what this verse right here kind of gets me excited, because I feel like this is the difference in every church I've attended in Legacy Bible Church. Okay, so the NIV puts pressure on you to come up with your interpretation. It is heavy, it is scary, that I'm just not going to pray in tongues because if I don't hear an interpretation. Versus what the new what Stephen translates, the literal translation gets you excited. He's saying, let them speak, let them pray.
Paul is saying, don't hinder them.
And it's
don't
exciting
forbid it.
because Paul's saying, in order that you might hear what is coming from heaven. Yeah. It's exciting. It gives me chills. It's like, we don't have to be scared. I don't have to feel burdened. I don't have to feel overwhelmed.
Yeah.
It's exciting.
And the interpretation might not come immediately. That's why Paul says later, if somebody is standing up giving a prophetic word and then the interpretation comes, guess what? The guy prophesying sits down. The interpretation goes first.
So the whole thing is exciting versus being heavy and burdensome. And well, then I'll just not say anything because if I don't come up with an interpretation, I'm out of order and I'm going to be criticized or you know.
And you're doing it all again.
It's all on you.
Yeah.
It's all on you.
Yeah. And all Paul is saying is he's not saying that there was anything wrong with the speaking in tongue that doesn't have an interpretation. He's just saying after 3 events, we're just going to assume the Lord's not going to give an interpretation in this corporate setting and we're going to move on.
That's so good. That right there summarized that's where we're going to stop because that summarized everything that I wanted.
Yeah. Because there may not be an interpretation.
And that's okay.
But after 3 corporate events, Paul is saying, time to move on. Let's go back to the prophetic words, and we're going to limit that to 3. And then what happens after the 3 possible events of speaking in tongues and 3 possible events of prophetic words, then there's going to be doctrinal teaching about the faith or corporate worship.
That's good.
Yeah.
It's real good.
Are we done?
Yeah.
All right.
That was good.
Well, thank you for bringing such an important and grossly misunderstood subject here to talk about today. Yeah. And so we'll be back on Sunday. I'm not sure at this point what we're going to be teaching about on Sunday, but we'll be back with a new series. I finished with the Sermon on the Mount on Sunday, and then God willing, we'll be back with Sarah next Wednesday. So we'll see you then.